Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we open up the pages and explore the world's oldest work of extant literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest work of extant literature yet known in the world. The text was discovered in the 19th century and patched together into a working piece of literature, and is a foundational read in any mythology or ancient Near East class. It is also an ancient tale we are all familiar with. The heroic warrior who defeats a monster, loses his companion, and reaches the end of the journey, only to have his prize remain elusive. Beyond being a thrilling read and a prism into a world seemingly very distant from our own, we must ask whether there are any deep truths or meaning behind the text. Why should we, in the 21st century, care about a work that is nearly 5,000 years old? I wish to examine several key features of the Epic of Gilgamesh in light of philosophy, anthropology, and literary culture. The first feature is Gilgamesh as the hero archetype. Second is the relational aspect of Enkidu and what the friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu tells us about the human condition. The third feature is the giant monster archetype in the creature Humbaba and why he resides in the cedar forest and what the confrontation between Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and Humbaba might mean in light of the Neolithic Revolution. Lastly, I also wish to examine the issue of a plant of life and what that also entails in the broader context of the Neolithic Revolution. The main character of the Epic of Gilgamesh is its titular protagonist. Gilgamesh is the king of Uruk, and most scholars agree that there was a historical Gilgamesh who ruled in the early 3rd millennium BC. Gilgamesh is the literary embodiment of the hero archetype of Hegelian philosophy and anthropology. The opening lines of the epic give paeans to Gilgamesh, the great king. It recounts the story of Gilgamesh having seen the deep, wandering the far lands, and founding a great city that the people of Uruk now occupy. This is the prototypical praise of the founding father, who is worshipped as a semi-divine being, as the text says, 2/3 God and 1/3 man. According to Hegel, the founder of civilization is conceived of as a deity, with his successors or heirs being the divine king or the divine emperor, who, nevertheless, over time, loses his divine status as the democratization of society commences. Regardless, Gilgamesh is certainly cast as the heroic god-king in the opening lines of the poem, a testament to the reality of the divine hero archetype in ancient mythopoetic literature. Moreover, he is the great king, the greatest king, the king that no later king could ever copy, and surpassing all other kings, heroic in stature, as the poet says. Gilgamesh serves as the secular deity and father of the people of Uruk. This is partly due to the nature of Sumerian anthropology and religion, which was, in comparison to Christianity, otherwise very bleak. Men were created as the toiling slaves of the gods, the puppets of the gods, to borrow a phrase from the Greeks. The gods crafted man and decreed their fates. There is nothing man can do about this, as Gilgamesh will find out by the end of the epic. While the Sumerians were deeply religious, and the Sumerian city and social life was organized around the temple cults and religious festivals, as Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer and Henry Frankfurt detail in their works on ancient Mesopotamian society, the worship of Gilgamesh as father figure represents the origin story of the Sumerian people, who gives praise to a man rather than to the gods, for it is a man, not the gods, who have brought them civilization and liberty, even though Gilgamesh is conceived of as a semi-divine being. This is no different in some respects than King Arthur or George Washington as fathers of their country. They are men, but in our approach to these great men, they have a certain mythic, divine, religious status and spirit to them. This issue of Gilgamesh as father king is also an issue of fatherhood. People come into being by genealogy and trace genealogy as their roots. People do not come into existence via self-creation. Nations have their fathers, just as children have their fathers. In his lectures on the philosophy of history, Hegel notes that the hero archetype is the founding father of states, thus the founding father of particular societies. Gilgamesh, whether he was the first king or not, is remembered as the hero founding father of the state of Uruk. Thus the people of Uruk praise him and credit him for their life and prosperity. Hegel also asserted that these heroes achieve immortality through their divinization by the successive tribe which they brought to settlement. Gilgamesh again checks the credential off the list as the settlement of Uruk, commenced by him, is his enduring and immortal legacy, which is what the people remember him for. While the opening of the poem gives praise to Gilgamesh, the rest of the story, which chronologically begins with the creation of Enkidu to rival Gilgamesh, casts Gilgamesh in a sort of coming-of-age tale or light. While the opening stanzas depict Gilgamesh, the wanderer having become the judge-king whom settles disputes and maintains the rule of law while winning the praise of his fellow citizens in praise, the Gilgamesh of the story, as it unfolds, is not always depicted in the most favorable light. He makes mistakes, and he has worries. For one, he is frightened by the prospects of journeying and confronting Humbaba in the cedar forest. He has an existential dread of death after Enkidu dies. He is excoriated by the wise man, Utnapishtim, for abandoning his people and the duties that fall to a man and to a king, also mocking him for dressing like a wild man when in lion's garb. Gilgamesh weeps like an immature child when the snake eats the plant of life. There are plenty of moments where Gilgamesh comes across as an immature and frightened boy, but given that the epic is, in many ways, as we've mentioned, a coming-of-age tale, a sort of Bildungsroman of the great king, it makes Gilgamesh's transformation into the great king all the more laudable. He is, in fact, someone whom we, as mortals, can identify with and hope to aspire to be. Again, he is not purely divine, without any marks of reproach. He is a person who suffers the same fears and existential dread that we do. Yet, he soldiers on, he perseveres and overcomes. That is what we ought to emulate. The poem ends with Gilgamesh telling the ferryman of the walls and the city he has helped to build, the very city whose foundation is praised in the opening stanza. Thus the epic ends where it started. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality failed, so in place of bodily immortality, he leaves his legacy through a monument, the very city of Uruk, which gives life to people. In this sense, Gilgamesh did achieve what Utnapishtim achieved in creating the great boat that survived the deluge, earning him eternal life from the gods. In accepting the reality of death, Gilgamesh establishes the foundation for life in the walls of Uruk. For when Gilgamesh fretted over death, he became an animalized man, reminiscent of the early Enkidu, journeying out into the wild and wearing lion skins. He had abandoned the duties of a man and a king the duties to home, family, inheritance, and country. Ever do we build our households, ever do we make our nests, ever do brothers divide their inheritance, ever do feuds arise in the land. And it is precisely because Gilgamesh returns to Uruk, builds up the city, passes it on to his people who trust him to rule over them and to look after them, that he achieves immortality and ensures that life continues for his people. The hero who founds the state, civilization according to Hegel, is the individual who acts with the common good in mind and ensures, through his actions, the settlement and continuity of his peoples. Part of the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh is Gilgamesh's adventure and quest for immortal life. Another part of the story is Gilgamesh's obvious role as the hero founder of Uruk, memorialized through the epic itself. In founding Uruk, Gilgamesh is a divine father, giving life to his children, the citizens of Uruk, who commemorate him because of his heroic actions, which they are now beneficiaries of. Thus, Gilgamesh is the God King, God the Father, so to speak, who has created the world of life and liberty, which humans can now fruitfully enjoy without fear and dread. Moreover, the praise of Gilgamesh is reflective of the anthropological insight of man as a cultural animal, and not merely a political animal or a consumeristic being. Man is an animal of praise. He seeks praise and wants to give praise when he has an appreciation of life. In appreciating the lives they now enjoy, the people of Uruk give praise to Gilgamesh, the man responsible for the fruit they eat. And the praise Gilgamesh receives is the immortality he wins for bestowing life, civilization, and culture to the people. While Gilgamesh is the titular protagonist, perhaps the most memorable character of the Epic of Gilgamesh is Enkidu, the wild man created by the god Aruru to rival and challenge Gilgamesh, but who later befriends him and whose death causes Gilgamesh that existential dread over mortality. Enkidu is also the most interesting figure to examine from a purely mythological and philosophical perspective. While Gilgamesh is considered to have been a historical person, as we've mentioned, scholars remain divided as to whether Enkidu would have had any historical basis, whether he was based on a historical counselor to the king or not. Regardless, the many symbolic themes that carry with the character of Enkidu is what now concerns us. Enkidu is created by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh in his early arrogance. In principle, the gods are terrified of what Gilgamesh is becoming and what he might do to them through his power and the adoration he receives from his people. Because Gilgamesh is strong and also handsome, the gods create Enkidu, who rivals Gilgamesh in strength, but lacks his beauty and cultivated manners. This is because, as I can see it, Enkidu represents primordial man, the hairy, disheveled, animalistic brute, who doesn't have reason and lives like the animals, that is, purely on his bodily desires and instincts. He is like the great ape of years before, a man who is yet a man who is more animalistic than civilized and refined. He is the man that humans used to be before the Neolithic Revolution. Even after entering Uruk, Enkidu does not know how to eat, drink, or properly dress himself, the hallmarks of a civilized and urban living. Enkidu, as many Assyriologists point out, likely represents the homogenized composite of the, quote, man outside the walls, the barbarian whose speech doesn't make sense, whose way of life with the animals seems shocking and unbefitting of a man, but who seeks out the civilized life offered in the aftermath of the Neolithic Revolution and the creation of urban agricultural centers. This fact cannot be lost on readers of the epic. We are reading the oldest work of extant literature thus far recovered in human history. It is written, if dating is correct, in the mid-2300s BC. While well after the Neolithic Revolution, evolutionarily speaking, it is not that far removed from when Neolithic man settled the dust and began to raise crops and domesticate animals for his well-being and livelihood. The Neolithic Revolution marked a major turning point in human history. No longer the wandering brutes of the past, man became a civilized, rational thinking, law-abiding, nature-conquering being. Man was, in the terminology of Hannah Arendt, Homo faber, man the maker. All of these themes are present in the Epic of Gilgamesh and are contained in the person of Enkidu, which is why he is the most interesting and enduring character in the work. When he is first introduced, he knows not a people, nor even a country. He is an unsettled savage. He is alone, a wanderer, a brute, who does not possess reason. He is described like an animal, ungroomed hair and beastly in attitude and power. It is only after his taming and settling in Uruk that he becomes a man, especially in the Aristotelian sense, a rational and social animal. Prior to his arrival in Uruk, Enkidu is an irrational animal and an asocial or solitary animal. The bumbling, stumbling, brutish beast that Enkidu is before his encounter with Shamhat and arrival in Uruk is the primordial man before the Neolithic Revolution. And as some men founded cities, those who did not were intrigued by the towering walls and houses that began to dot the landscape, and they inquisitively wanted to know about the city, thus the birth of reason in man. Rationality is what the ancient philosophers, Greek, Roman, and Christian, considered to be the distinctive feature of man as the rational animal. Whereas animals simply follow their instincts and desires, man has the capacity of mastering his instincts and desires and ordering them through reason to more productive and civilized ends. As Aristotle said in his Politics, civilized man can be known based on how he eats and how he has sex. Reread the first 2 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh very carefully, in light of Aristotle's comments. Enkidu's turn to civilization is based on sex and eating, the 2 things that Aristotle identified as the hallmarks of a civilized people. In the words of the great English poet John Milton in Paradise Lost, "Yet not so strictly hath our Lord imposed labor as to debar us when we need refreshment, whether food or talk between, food of the mind, or this sweet intercourse, of looks and smiles, for smiles from reason flow, to brute denied, and our love the food, love not the lowest end of human life." Man, unlike animals, can appreciate the sweetness of life, sex, and food. As Dante said in Purgatorio, "The soul which is created quick to love responds to everything that pleases, just as soon as beauty wakens it to act." Enkidu is, at first, the wild man, the primordial man who follows his animalistic instincts. Animal man is the antithesis, of course, to civilized man. This is why the gods created Enkidu to rival civilized Gilgamesh. Animal man, in his brutality, pure desire, and irrationality, threatens everything that rational and civilized man has constructed: order, social function, and the taming of his animalistic impulses, and directed those animalistic impulses to spouse, family, and country. Thus, this is what Enkidu must lose before being civilized. His brutality, his animalism, and his uncontrollable desire as he roams aimlessly like the gazelles, simply feeding his desires and moving on to another location to do the same. But those desires deep within primordial man remain in civilized man. They are simply ordered to more productive ends. Shamhat is the tertiary protagonist in the story and the most important woman in the story. She is a sacred harlot, a sex priestess, which was an important position in ancient Mesopotamian society. While the Greek historian Herodotus deplored the practice of sacred sex in the fertility cults of the Near East, Shamhat serves a very important role in the story. She is the individual who civilizes Enkidu, teaches him the sacred meaning of sex and family, teaches him how to eat and dress, and inducts Enkidu into social life. It is interesting to highlight how Enkidu, created by the fertility goddess Aruru, is civilized through the sexual act. And again, as Aristotle said, it is sex and eating which are the hallmarks of any civilized people. Where Enkidu is solitary, Uruk is social. Where Enkidu is an animal, the citizens of Uruk are civilized. Where Enkidu doesn't know how to eat like a person, instead foraging like the animals, the people of Uruk have table manners, cooked food, and appropriate dress. As the poet writes, "For man, when perfected, is the best of animals, but when separated from law and justice, he is the worst of all." Those fateful words from Aristotle accurately summarize the dialectical contrast between Enkidu the wild man and Enkidu the civilized man after his encounter with Shamhat. For man, when he is perfected, as Aristotle noted, is the best of animals, but when he is separated from law and justice, when he is separated from the social world, he is the worst of all. When the hunter tasked with finding Enkidu discovers him, having brought Shamhat along, he tells her, "This is he, Shamhat. Uncradle your bosom, bare your sex. Let him take in your charms. Do not recoil. Take in his scent. He will see you and will approach you. Spread your clothing so he may lie on you. Do for the man the work of a woman. Let his passions caress you and embrace you. His herd will spurn him, though he grew up amongst it." The encounter of Enkidu and Shamhat has been one of the most discussed parts of the epic. Feminists, naturally, have despised it for its patriarchal and demeaning language and dialectic. Anthropologists and philosophers, by contrast, more educated and intellectual people, have generally seen the tremendous symbolism entailed in the encounter of wild man and civilized woman, and the dignified position, not the undignified position, that Shamhat plays in the narrative, becoming the sort of adoptive wife of Enkidu. Not all feminists, we might add, have recoiled at the depiction of sacred sex and the role of sex in the birth of civilization. Camille Paglia stands against the grain insofar that she sees the powerful role of the feminine mystique in the sex act and the power that woman holds over man through the sexual act in of itself. As Paglia explained in Sexual Personae, the sexual act brings out the true character of man, just as Aristotle had said 2,500 years ago. His depravity or exquisiteness also is revealed in the sexual act. From the feminine perspective, the power of women over men as it relates to the civilizing role of sex and how through the sexual act came the glories of ordered civilization, where men had to tame and order their sexual drive and replace belly magic with head magic, is all seen here in the encounter between Enkidu and Shamhat. This transformation in civilization, Paglia notes, though men took the lead, was spurred by man's simultaneous fear and honoring of woman and entirely related to the sexual act. Sex not only brought forth personal identity and distinctiveness, it brought about ordered civilization in of itself. Although the Catholic Church is often demeaned as anti-woman by those who know next to nothing about the complexity and depth of Catholic anthropological and civilizational thinking, Catholic sexual ethics also expounds on the reality of woman as the civilizer of man as seen through the encounter of Enkidu and Shamhat. Women set the bar of civilization because man is a creature of erotic desire first and foremost, and sets his use of reason to the sexual act. Men will engage in rational thinking and cunning in order to have sex with women. When women set the bar high for sex, men will follow. When women set the bar low for sex, men will also follow. Sex brings about the elevation and dignification of man. Or, alternatively, sex brings out the denigration and animalization of man. We must note that the transformation of Enkidu from an animalized man to a civilized man is purely contained to Enkidu. Women do not move in this dialectic to civilization or uncivilization. It is men through sex who become either civilized and refined or who remain animalized and barbarous. This is why Aristotle remarked that sex is one of the telltale signs of civilization. Animal sex is unpassionate, instrumental, purely utilitarian, and stems from nothing more than desire as desire in of itself. Animals have sex because they need to have sex and nothing more. Human sex, from the standpoint of anthropological humanism, is something far more exquisite. It represents a training in virtue, in the words of Augustine. It represents the civilized nature of man and society, according to Aristotle. And it represents the real power that women hold over men, according to Camille Paglia. Humans are social and relational animals. This is the main difference between classical anthropology and modern anthropology. Classical anthropology affirms man's social and relational nature, that humans flourish when in relationships, and that the basis of all civilization is the family, which is brought together, of course, through the conjugal act of sex. Modern anthropology affirms man's solitary nature, that humans flourish best when they are alone to follow their desires for self-preservation and nothing more. Family, in particular, is the biggest barrier to human freedom, individual choice, and movement. Enkidu, prior to sex, is an animal, but he is also the solitary creature. After sex, he's becoming a man. He caresses and has an intimate relationship with another person for the first time in his life, and brings out his humanity rather than his base animalistic spirit. This transforms him, literally, over the course of the pages of the Epic of Gilgamesh. When he stands up and heads to the herd of gazelles, they panic and flee from him. He eventually returns to Uruk with Shamhat, where he learns the art of eating and dressing. Through sex, Shamhat introduces Enkidu to civilization and the marriage rite, where he meets Gilgamesh presiding over an event that he doesn't understand because animals do not marry. Through sex, Shamhat has taught Enkidu to master his animal desires and direct them to higher goods, the higher goods of civilization, family, state, and society. When entering Uruk, Enkidu does not know how to eat. After sex with Shamhat and her tutelage, Enkidu comes to know table manners and when to eat, again a mastery of the passions. Man, left alone, as Enkidu was before meeting and making love with Shamhat, is nothing but a brutish animal that follows his desires without any self-mastery and is incapable of social living and personal virtue. Man, when united with a woman, as Enkidu becomes in his meeting and making love with Shamhat, becomes a groomed, civilized, well-spoken, and more importantly, rational being. As the author of the poem states, after rising to his feet after sex, he had reason and wide understanding. The sex act and eating rituals, along with the marriage rite that Enkidu observes, is the trinity of civilization, and all three are integrally related to each other. Ordered sexual drive leads to marriage, and the celebration of the union of male and female entails the celebratory eating of food, the celebratory wedding dinner that any of us who have attended a wedding are familiar with, where, of course, the sophistication of human civilization is fully on display. We are the only animals who create such an elaborate ritual of civilized celebration to celebrate the coming together of two people in a sexual union. Enkidu, having been an animal, confesses to Shamhat he does not know what is going on when he first encounters the sophistication of human society and its rituals. Sex divorced from family, eating divorced from ritual and manner, and marriage divorced from social union simply returns man to his primitive and barbaric state of existence. The ordering of sex, eating, and marriage to more than self-pleasure and self-want is the basis on which civilization rises and falls. Sex, therefore, is also the induction of the person into a civilized society. For what is a man but an animal when he brutishly engages in self-gratifying sex and eating and doesn't commit himself to marriage, but lives a life of licentious animalism? For what is man but a man when he exercises control in sex and eating and commits himself to a lifelong relationship of love with a woman, to have children, to raise them, and to ensure the continuity and the continuation of the sacred seed of life and civilization itself? This is further implied through the fact that Shamhat is, of course, a sacred harlot, not just a mere prostitute. The sacredness and the mystery of sex and its civilizing power bound up in the functionary religious role she has in Sumerian society is the very spirit that moves Shamhat in the epic. Here, the understanding of sex and civilization from Aristotle, Catholic anthropology, and Camille Paglia are better understood. As we've mentioned, all animals have sexual urges. The question for man is whether he follows the animalistic way, which is to simply have sex at will and for purely instrumental use, or whether he follows the civilized path, which is to control the urge, unite with the spouse, and procreate for the health of society and civilization. Moreover, as Camille Paglia asserts, the sex drive and sex act show the real character of a person. Furthermore, women really do control the highs and lows of civilization with the sexual act itself. For it is woman who guards sexual ethics, and with it, the animalization or the cultivation of civilization and human society and interactions. If women act like animals, man will follow her and become an animal, just as Enkidu was before their encounter. If women act like a dignified human being, then men will follow and become dignified human beings, just as Enkidu became through his sexual encounter with Shamhat. Paglia notes that man truly is a creature of erotic desire. In this sense, the starting point of all humans is that of an animal, just as Enkidu is. But the task of humanization is to be made human, rather than to remain an animal. Ibn Rushdie, also known to us as Averroes, one of the foremost medieval Islamic philosophers, said the task of humanization was to turn an animal into a man through the cultivated use of imagination, his soul, i.e. rationality, and the ordering of sexual instinct. This is what made man distinct from the rest of the animal kingdom. While it is true that some men are sadistic and will behave as brutes engaged in the lust for domination through sexual libido, most men are not like that, but take cues from the broader sexual, and fetishistic mores of their environment. Women control the future of civilization, just as Shamhat controls the future of Enkidu civilization, because of the mysterious and civilizing power of sex. And Shamhat demonstrates this in her bedding and civilizing of Enkidu. She, and not Enkidu, is the prime mover in Enkidu's civilizing. In the epic, we see what Camille Paglia has always noted about sex and the feminine mystique. Women, not men, are the prime movers in the ordering of civilization through how they act in sexual encounters. Enkidu owes his newfound way of life, his friendships, his loyalty to country, and his social mores to Shamhat. Shamhat is not the undignified harlot abused by Enkidu like so many feminist critics like to say, but she is the sacred and mysterious feminine mystique that brings civilization to Enkidu's life. It is through their sexual encounter that Enkidu learns to master his passions, shed away his animalistic side, learn the customs and manners of civilized society, enjoy life in society, develop friendship, and become appreciative of life itself. Shamhat civilizes Enkidu, not Gilgamesh, and not Enkidu himself, and she civilizes him through the mystical union of two flesh becoming one in the sexual encounter. Lastly, the final unmissable aspect of Enkidu in the epic is the friendship he forms with Gilgamesh. At first they wrestle with each other, but then they become friends after this conflict wherein Enkidu yields to Gilgamesh's superiority. This conflict turning to yielding is a common theme in human literature. From vanquishing comes friendship, deep and intimate friendship. Moreover, Enkidu accepts his place in the pecking order with Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the head and Enkidu the body. The theme of conflict leading to friendship is visible in other great works of literature, such as How Green Was My Valley, Captain Courageous, and even Great Expectations, when Pip and Herbert first meet and have their little game of boxing. In the ancient world, friendship was something intimate and deeply personal. Modernists sometimes read homoerotic overtures into the relationships, but such readings only emerged after the 1970s, and I wonder why. Most scholars do not consider the nature of the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu to be homoerotic in nature, in the modern sense of how we think of homosexual relationships, but reflective of the deep, intimate, and personal reality that ancient friendships entailed. The deeply intimate friendship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu is shocking to modern readers because we live in a deeply depersonalized world with very few friendships. St. Augustine, one of the great writers on friendship in antiquity, argued that friends are not only equals with one another, but people whom we have an intimate relationship with. Friends are people whom we share secrets with, whom are our companions in life, always around us and we with them, and whom we love and are willing to sacrifice and die for. If that is the definition of friendship, how many friends can we say we actually have in life? Friends are not mere acquaintances and people we have some social interaction with. Friends are people whom we divulge our innermost secrets to, people whom we have very personal and intimate relationships with, people whom we know like the back of our hands. Paul Friedman, a historian at Yale, noted the sudden explosion of homoerotic interpretations of various famous friendships in classical literature, including Augustine in Confessions, which he, of course, has brushed aside as modernist ideological eisegesis. Concerning the prevalence of intimate friendships in classical literature, there is, of course, David and Jonathan in the Hebrew Bible, Augustine and Alypius in the aforementioned Confessions, and perhaps most famously, Achilles and Patroclus in the Iliad. Xenophon, the ancient Greek philosopher and historian, took time to comment that there was no romantic relationship between the two in Homer's epic, and that a multitude of other classicists and literary critics have written against reading homoerotic overtures in classical friendship literature. Instead, what they argue is that we must understand the nature of ancient friendship. In this way, Gilgamesh and Enkidu are the first to embody the intimate friendship archetype in the ancient world. As mentioned, all the other great works of friendship in classical literature are written thousands of years after the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh establishes for us and for posterity this intimacy of friendship in literature. This is because, again, the ancient world asserted that man was not merely a social animal, but more intimately a relational animal. This theme is, of course, also found in the Genesis creation narrative with the creation of Adam and Eve. It is asserted by Plato and Aristotle and all of the Greek philosophers in their writings, and certainly affirmed in the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu as we read through it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They are constantly by each other's side. They are constantly engaged in adventures and journeys with one another, and they are willing to sacrifice and die for each other in their adventures. It is important to remember what Enkidu was before his civilizing by Shamhat, and what Enkidu becomes after his civilizing. Through his civilizing, he becomes a groomed, respectable, and social person, bound up with the social custom and mores of ancient Mesopotamian society. Ancient life was excessively social. Any reader of Plato or Aristotle would also know this. The social nature of the Sumerian city is on display when Enkidu enters it. There are festivals and religious rites being publicly performed for all to participate in. Enkidu meets Gilgamesh in a marriage ceremony where he learned to properly eat and clothe himself, which was also, of course, a very public affair in the ancient world, and in fact remains a deeply public affair in traditional areas of the world. In the companionship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, we see the social dynamic of man's nature becoming crystallized for us. Gilgamesh and Enkidu are always beside one another, even unto the bitter end. C.S. Lewis wrote that you can tell the love of friends based on their companionship with each other. Lovers, C.S. Lewis noted, gaze upon each other's faces. Friends are always by each other's side, companions forever in adventure and journey. Enkidu's death causes existential dread to overcome Gilgamesh. Even Enkidu seems angry with the fact that he is going to die and curses life. All the farmers, herders, and craftsmen, and even Shamhat for his predicament. In Enkidu's cursing of life, he reflects, momentarily, the bitter and nihilistic strand of human existence and nature. In cursing Shamhat, he wishes to have remained with the animals, then become aware of his own mortality. Ignorance, as Enkidu implies in this moment, is truly bliss. But Enkidu is assuaged from his bitterness, and he comes to bless Shamhat and the rest of the Sumerian people. Enkidu celebrates the gift of life, even though he knows he will soon die. The funeral rite and ceremony Gilgamesh gives him is not merely mourning of life and a friend, but a celebration of a life lived. Funeral rites were important in ancient society and remain important in traditional religious sects such as Catholicism and Islam. Funeral rites are important because they are meant to give praise to the individual's life, his worth, and importance during life. Friends, family, and indeed the whole city participate in the funeral. Gilgamesh and Enkidu's relationship is nothing short of the deeply personal and relational nature of man, the realities that come with living in a social world, the deeply personal and intimate relationships that ancient man had with his fellow man in antiquity. The very word for society, mind you, comes from the Latin word socius, or soci, plural, which translates into friend. Civilization, society, is composed of friends. People whom we know, spend time with, care for, love, and are willing to die for. That is a civilization. People whom we don't know, who we don't care for, who we are not willing to sacrifice and die for. That is not a society. Gilgamesh loved Enkidu because he was his friend. Friendship in the ancient world was vastly different than what we call friendship today. Ancient friendship was intimate, while modern friendship is also very depersonalized. Just think, in the Gospel of John, the famous statement by Jesus Christ himself, that love is when a man is willing to lay down his life for his friends. Again, if that is the mark of friendship, how many friends do we really have today? How many friends are we willing to die for? This is why moderns have often struggled reading back on the friendship narratives of classical literature, Gilgamesh and Enkidu being no different. But once we understand the nature of ancient friendship and the intimate sociality of ancient civilization, the friendship of Enkidu and Gilgamesh becomes more apparent for us. And again, we also realize the transformation of Enkidu from a primordial man who lacked those things into a civilized man who gained those things. The civilizing of Enkidu comes about by life in the city, his introduction to sex, eating, and the marriage rites, as we've already discussed, and his friendship with Gilgamesh. In essence, Enkidu becomes a man by passing through the rites of passage of adulthood and becoming a member of that excellent city which Aristotle talks about in his Politics. We now turn to the Slaying of Humbaba as one of the more memorable, if not most memorable, story contained in the epic. It is also a story that any student of myth knows. The hero venturing away from home into a mysterious and dangerous foreign land where a beast or monster presides that he must overcome in order to complete the quest. Humbaba is the dragon archetype of medieval-esque fantasy literature, or more straightforwardly, Humbaba is the classical monster archetype of any mythological fantasy. But what does Humbaba represent, and why must man kill this guardian of the forest? Most commentaries over Humbaba are now grounded in evolutionary thought. During the beginning of mankind's evolution to Homo sapiens, animals, nature, and the forest were exceedingly dangerous to primordial man. Animals were literally monsters to our early hominid ancestors. It is only after the Neolithic Revolution that man begins to tame nature or to conquer nature and domesticate animals for their self-use and gain. Humbaba is described in most English translations as an ogre, and while Humbaba is not well described in the Epic of Gilgamesh, additional Sumerian stories and iconography highlight him as a composite beast of natural animals who would have been predatory animals in early human history. His face is depicted as being that of a lion or a large cat of prey. His scaly body is reminiscent of that of a snake or some sort of large reptile of prey. And of course, as we know, reptiles were extremely dangerous to humans in our early past, and snakes remain dangerous to humans today. His feet are depicted as being that of a bird of prey, and there is plenty of fossil evidence that large predatory birds did attack humans. Legends of man-eating birds are likely the manifestation of predatory bird attacks. While most dangerous to children, the claws or talons of large birds of prey can also be deadly to adult humans. And if Humbaba's claws are reminiscent of a vulture, this makes sense given that human encounters with vultures would have likely been through their seeing these birds of prey consuming the rotting carcasses of humans, and, not knowing that the vulture is a scavenger, assumed that the vulture, a large bird, if you've ever seen one, had killed the human and is eating him. Thus, we begin to see the portrait of Humbaba as a composite of some of the deadliest early predatory animals that humans would have encountered prior to the formation of civilization, is the most important thing to understand about the battle between Gilgamesh, man, and the monster Humbaba, nature, the dialectic of man and nature. Thus, Humbaba represents predatory and dangerous nature. In fact, Gilgamesh is constantly frightened about the prospects of fighting the monster. He needs Enkidu to journey with him. He needs Enkidu to assuage his nightmares. He needs to forge tools and other weapons to defeat the monsters. His soldiers, before leaving, tell him not to rely on his physical strength, but to rely on his tools to defeat the monster. The battle between Gilgamesh and Humbaba is the story of man's triumph over nature. Gilgamesh is Neolithic man, armed with tools and cunning. Humbaba is the ancient guardian of the natural world, a composite monster of predatory beasts that were once a threat to humans, but who is now threatened by the new man and his tools. The tide has turned against nature, as it were, as man is now able to work with other men with tools to conquer nature. But Gilgamesh's triumph over Humbaba isn't his own doing. As mentioned already, he needs Enkidu, others, and weapons, tools, to defeat the monster. In other words, man cannot conquer nature alone. It is too difficult and too time-consuming, even with the advances made in the Neolithic Revolution. The slaying of Humbaba is necessary for man to begin to fell the forest and use the timber for his own purposes. Symbolically, this represents man's defeat of animal life as he drives them away from their homes to fell the cedar wood he needs to construct the mighty and impressive cities that are springing up across the Fertile Crescent. After all, what happens after killing Humbaba in the story? Gilgamesh and Enkidu proceed to chop down cedar trees and celebrate their achievement. Having slayed the predatory beasts that once preyed of men, and having slayed the guardians of the forest that prevented man from entering and felling the timber needed to construct cities and towns, man is subsequently able to build his monuments and cities and farms to sustain his new way of life. For conservationists and environmentalists, or for those with an understanding of man's libido, the story of the death of Humbaba is certainly a tragic one. Humbaba is the guardian of the forest because, as predatory beast, he prevents man from entering the forest and bringing back the goods necessary for urban life. But once the guardian is defeated, man can roam the forest freely and fell as many trees and bring back as many smaller and non-dangerous animals back for food. The killing of Humbaba represents man's conquest and subsequent domination of nature through the use of tools, weapons, and others. For how is Humbaba killed? By the tools that Gilgamesh and Enkidu forged for themselves before embarking on the journey to the cedar forest. I am skipping over commentary on Ishtar and the Bull of Heaven for the sake of brevity. That said, I should mention the obvious with Ishtar as the prototypical femme fatale in literature. Where Shamhat is sexuality ordered to civilization, Ishtar is sexuality unleashed in the service of only the self, which produces destruction. But nevertheless, the second half of the Epic of Gilgamesh deals with Gilgamesh's quest for immortality and the plant of life. That Gilgamesh searches for a plant is reflective of the agrarian nature of ancient Near Eastern civilization. The Sumerians were, of course, as we know, an urban people. The civilization of the Sumerians was centered on the city, but the city was sustained by agriculture. Dialectical dynamism between cities and countryside, urban and rural, are well documented and well discussed in philosophy and political theory. That dialectical dynamism is not absent in the Epic of Gilgamesh. We note that it is through Neolithic agricultural revolution that the urban city is present to us. Evolutionarily, man was a wandering forager who suffered extensive atrophy of firstborn males and members of the tribe more generally. It is thought that up to 30% of firstborn males died off defending the tribe from attacks from other tribes and other assaults from wildlife, as man slowly transformed from a wandering savage to a civilized settler. With the newfound way of life that came with the agricultural revolution, man, aware of mortality at this time, would have likely thought that there might have been a plant or a seed of life that could be used to sustain them. Agrarian imagery associated with life is widespread in all ancient literature. Genesis has a tree of life planted in the Garden of Eden. Gilgamesh searches, of course, in this epic for the plant of life that holds the seed of immortality. Zoroastrian literature also invokes the tree of life. Taoism asserted that there was a peach of immortality. In short, agrarian society and its literature is ripe, pardon the pun, with imagery of a plant, fruit, or tree of life. This is because as man began to settle and began to farm, with relative peace and security around him, rather than weariness and strife as before, he began to think that the fruit or organic growth he planted and consumed could possibly sustain him indefinitely. We know that through the Neolithic Revolution and agriculture, mankind began to live healthier and longer than in pre-Neolithic times. It only makes sense, as this is also the moment in the evolution of human consciousness that man began to increase his rationality, that he might think that there was a plant of life that could sustain him for immortality. Consider how the conquest of nature coincides with the Neolithic Revolution, the use of tools, which lead to man's subjugation and domination of the natural world. No longer the victim, man is the victimizer, so to speak. In killing Humbaba, a turning point in the story where Gilgamesh begins to take on a role of a more pristine king, Gilgamesh and Enkidu proceed, as we mentioned, to cut down the trees for the use of timber back home. With this newfound power and newfound settlement, man would have looked to plant life, agrarian sustenance, for his health and well-being. Finally freed from the victim of nature, or so man thinks, he begins to look to nature as that which can bring forth his salvation, sustain him, give him life, nourish him. Thus it is unsurprising that with human life now bound up with agriculture and plant life, that man would seek immortality in the form of a plant. Of course, this is the quest that Gilgamesh embarks on, and of course, the quest for immortality, at least this kind of immortality, fails. Gilgamesh does not return with a plant of life and must accept the reality of death. In the standard tablet, a snake eats the plant of life and sheds its skin. This is reflective of the superstitious belief of ancient peoples that snakes lived forever, naturally, unless killed. After all, if you saw snakeskin, but not its dead carcass, you would probably have thought the same. The evidence, of course, that they saw this would have been readily apparent. Primordial man lived in places filled with snakes. But the role of the plant life the role of a plant of life that Gilgamesh embarks on to try to find should be obvious enough within the context of the Neolithic Revolution, especially with its relationship to the broader realities of agricultural settlement. That is the environment in which the Epic of Gilgamesh is situated in. Gilgamesh, living in a social world sustained by agriculture, living a longer and healthier life precisely because of agriculture, naturally would have sought to find the miracle plant of life that would gain us immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest known work of human literature. Much of the work has been reconstituted from surviving fragments found in Turkey and Iraq. The story remains fragmented as a result. While many may brush aside the epic as mere fairy tale, we can, hopefully, see many deep truths and insights contained in the nature of the work, especially when approached from a philosophical, anthropological, and historicist perspective. Many of the themes of the story are themes that would eventually be more specifically examined in greater detail with the rise of philosophy. There are several claims contained in the work that are worth deep reflection on. The first is the role of sex and eating in civilization. The epic makes clear that sex and eating are prerequisites for civilization. Aristotle would later comment, as we've mentioned, about the role of sex and eating as reflective of man's civilized greatness or animalized barbarism in the politics. And this is what we see in Enkidu in his encounter with Shamhat and his socialization within the city of Uruk. The second is the role of woman, represented by Shamhat in this process of sexual civilization. Those feminists who get uneasy about the role of Shamhat ought to realize and read the deeper, more profound insights that the epic is telling us, especially when assessed with the writings of Camille Paglia and Aristotle. Shamhat controlled the destiny of Enkidu and turned him from an animal into a man. A third theme that we ought to concern ourselves with is the deeply social and intimate nature of society and friendship, and how man benefits from having such personal and intimate relationships. Next, there are several historical features of the story that are worth reflecting on. What is the role of Humbaba in the story? Accepting evolution as a basic fact and knowing about the bloodbath that was evolution, Humbaba's composite nature of lion, snake, and eagle or vulture is a clear hearkening back to when predatory animals were dangerous and a threat to man's life. The killing of Humbaba represents man's triumph over nature through the use of tools and cunning, the Neolithic Revolution. And the Neolithic Revolution should be in the mind of all readers of the epic, given that the work would have been composed at the end of the Neolithic transformation in the late 3rd millennium BC. Another historical feature, of course, that is worth reflecting on is why the search for immortality revolves around a plant of life. We should also note, as Hegel noted, whether or not humans have an instinctive appetite, pardon the pun, for worshipping heroic figures, god kings and founders of civilizations. We all know in our own human societies that we have revered figures who sort of stand as a Moses, as a god figure who created the civilization and the dream for our civilization going forward. Far from being a fairy tale, the Epic of Gilgamesh is a timeless classic. It is a work of ancient men, to be sure, but contained within its poetry are deep reflections upon human nature, the human condition, and the human experience. Furthermore, it is a glimpse into the past now lost, but recoverable by those who read the work and understand it as more than just a fanciful and make-believe story.